Okay, everybody, good morning. For those of you who already can see us, thank you for joining. I know it takes about a minute or so for everybody to join in. I want to briefly just say, as people are joining, this week we will be skipping the usual weekly updates. Since March of 2020, we've been doing weekly updates at the beginning of grand rounds, both in combination because we're starting to need less updates. And also today we have a very, very special discussion, and we have a lot of presenters and panelists. We want to leave as much time as possible for that topic. We'll skip the weekly updates this week, but we will resume those next week, including updates from Dr. Pinsky on the variants, as well as updates from vaccine rollout and occupational health from Dr. Brian Bowman as well. So thank you to those doctors. And of course, we'll continue to provide updates on other topics as needed as well. If there's anything you haven't heard from or you'd like to hear from us, please do send feedback to us. I really appreciate that. But this week we have a very important topic. I want to first say our originally planned presenter notified us just 2 days ago on Monday morning that he had a family emergency and had to cancel. So just about a little over 24 hours, we came up with a number of presenters and a new topic. And one topic we've been wanting to cover is what's going on with the COVID-19 surge in India. So just in over 24 hours, we were able to get presenters joining us from Pune, India, as well as a number of our colleagues here who've been working on this topic. So I want to say thank you very much to everybody who's joining on really this last minute setup. And we really appreciate that. Before I get started with that, I want to just briefly mention, sharing my screen here, that next week we will have a presentation on Asian health, past, present, and future with Dr. Latha Palyanappan. Dr. Brighton Lin will be kicking off National Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We're really excited about that. We have Dr. Sarah Rudman, who is providing an update. The title's not mentioned here, but an update on the Santa Clara County response to COVID-19. She's the Assistant Public Health Officer for the Santa Clara County. And the week after that, we have Dr. Jason Wang, who's going to be talking about really the school openings regarding COVID-19. But today, we have a presentation by 3 special presenters joining us from remote in Pune, India. Dr. Priscilla Joshi is professor and head of the Department of Radiodiagnosis. She's also the vice principal of Bharati Vidyapeeth Medical College in Pune, India. Along with her, we have Dr. Shiva Iyer. He's also professor and head of critical care in this, also from Bharati Medical College. Finally, we have Dr. Sanjay Lalwani, who is the medical director at Bharati Medical College. He's also been in charge of multiple COVID-19 vaccine trials. All doctors Joshi, Iyer, and Lalwani were really reached out to, again, as I mentioned, just about 24 hours ago. And in that time, we've had a couple conference calls. They've been creating slides and really working diligently to provide us an update from the perspective of what's going on in India. Along with that, Dr. Michele Berry, who, as I think many, if not all of you know, our director at Center for Innovation and Global Health, Senior Associate Dean for Global Health, who has been on grand rounds with us multiple times. I always reach out to her constantly with hoping to get updates from her. She's so actively involved in so many ways. In fact, she just flew back yesterday from the Texas-Mexico border involved with the refugee situation down there, and is now hopping on to be the moderator of today's presentation. Many of our panelists, including Dr. Aruna Subramanian, Dr. Nidhi Rotagi, and I believe Dr. Manu Prakash is joining us. Dr. Subramanian is the clinical professor in chief of the Immunocompromised Host ID Service. She's also been on grand rounds for us multiple times this past year. Dr. Manu Prakash is associate professor of bioengineering and a senior fellow at the Woods Institute. And Dr. Nidhi Rotagi is the clinical associate professor and chief for the surgical manager section as well. And finally, Sona Thadani, she's the executive director for Presence and the program of bedside medicine. She runs that program as well as multiple programs. She's personally always one of these people that every time I have an issue, I reach out to, and she's extremely helpful. She's also a childhood friend of Dr. Priscilla Joshi and was instrumental in connecting and helping facilitate the communication and setup of today's presentation as well. So a special thank you to Sonu as well. And she's also going to be joining us on the panelist side. And with that, I want to turn the slides over now to Dr. Michele Berry, who's going to start us off with a little introduction before Dr. Iyer starts off his presentation. Michele, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. What I'd like to do is give you the 10,000-foot view of what's going on in India. And I have to thank our Indian presenters because there is a huge time difference. So I'm very appreciative of that. Good evening. Can I have the first slide, please? India is clearly undergoing a huge crisis. Second slide, I'm sorry. Next slide. And if you can't do that, I'll share my screen.
Can you not, is that not showing?
Yeah, now it's showing. And no, one back. So this is basically a graph that you can see. India had an early surge in July, August, and September, and now it's astronomically going up. You can see that the 14-day change is 131% of cases and 215% deaths. May I have the next slide? I just thought these are such striking numbers. I wanted to bring up the numbers. India accounts for 38% of the new global confirmed cases as of today. It's recently recorded 345,000 cases in a single day, the largest total recorded since the pandemic began. And the country has surpassed 2,800 deaths per day last week. And these are just the recorded cases. And I hope our panelists will talk about some of the problems with recording cases. Now, why is this happening? I think there's a conflagration of issues that our panelists will talk about, but you should also know that there's a new double mutant strain, B.1.617, which is a combination of the California and South Africa strains. Particularly the South Africa strain is worrisome because we know that that is not as sensitive to the AstraZeneca vaccine. There has recently also been described a triple mutant in Maharashtra state. May I have the next slide? When we think about these variants, we also need to think about what's happening with vaccination and what are some of the ramifications. I just want to remind us, and I think we forget this, that India is a huge player in the pharmaceutical industry. They provide 20% of the world's generic drugs and more than 60% of all of the world's vaccines. The Serum Institute is a major contributor to the COVAX initiative. And I think I've talked about that initiative in an earlier grand rounds, which is this consortium of countries that are trying to produce vaccines for low resource settings. They're also the manufacturer of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And there was just a recent announcement that the Serum Institute has come out that it will not be able to meet its international commitments because of India's shortage of vaccines. May I have the next slide? Appropriately so. So I just want to end this before we get to our panelists and have time for Q&A with a World Health Organization statement that just came out that really, I can't emphasize this more, than no one is safe until everyone is safe from this pandemic. Thank you, Errol. Over to Dr. Iyer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berry.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. So I'm going to share my screen now. So greetings from Pune, India. I'm an intensivist with an internal medicine background. And what I'm going to do today is to try and look at these questions as I go along in my presentation. So first question that I have is the surge any different than the rest of the world? The virus is mutated, and the double mutant and the triple mutant that Dr. Berry told us about, what does it imply in real terms? Have the modes of spread of the virus changed? Has our understanding changed in any fundamental way in the last 1 year? Has the pathogenesis been affected, or is it looking clinically any different than before? So I will share some of our subjective impressions. I don't have hard data to back that up, but I hope those insights will be useful. And then in the last 1 year, we've had a profusion of data, including many clinical trials coming from around the world. So has that changed our therapeutic options? And how has India responded to those changing therapeutic options? Have we adopted them? Have we not adopted them? What's happening? And is it any different from anywhere else in the world? And finally, I'm going to look at, are we better prepared to handle this surge than we were last year during the first wave? And what kind of preparation have we looked at doing in this last 1 year? So this is a slide that kind of repeats some of the things that Dr. Berry has told us about. And you can see this first map of India, in which you can see bubbles which indicate the number of cases. So the smallest bubbles are 30,000 cases. The next number of cases are 1.2 lakhs. And then the largest bubbles are 3 lakhs. And so you can see that India, being a large country, it has 29 different states with varying levels of literacy and of healthcare infrastructure. Not to mention the GDP of the various states also will vary. And one must remember that health in India is both a central and a state subject. And while it is the center's responsibility, the central government's responsibility to ensure following of the health policy, it is the job of the state to implement. And so you'll see that there may sometimes be a lot of confusion and center-state clashes around how exactly things are to be implemented. And then you can see the numbers at the bottom, and those numbers are huge. And like Dr. Berry pointed out, we had the largest number of recorded cases. We also had a very large number of deaths recorded on a single day. And Pune, had the dubious distinction of being a city, even though it's not a very large city in India, to have the maximum number of cases recorded in a single day. This was in the last week. I'm happy to say, however, that the numbers seem to have plateaued. And in the last few days, we are seeing that the numbers are not increasing exponentially as they were in the last week. I decided to look at how the first and the second peaks looked in the United States, and then, of course, in India and in Brazil and in the United Kingdom. So you can see in the slide that the subsequent peaks seem to have always been larger than the previous peaks. So in that sense, my feeling is that we are not any different from the other parts of the world in terms of the fact that the subsequent peaks are larger. What is different probably is that in India, being 29 different states, each area, each state is likely to peak at a slightly different time. And so we are likely to see the pandemic continuing for a longer time than is expected. So I do not think, so for example, if you look at the map of India that I have projected, you can see in the far northeast corner are the northeastern states, and there the number of states are number of cases are very few. And then, on the west, northwest, you can see state of Rajasthan. That because much of it is desert, does not really pay. You can see some of the larger bubbles in the center of India, and some of the smaller bubbles in the middle part of India probably represent under-reporting of cases, and under-reporting of cases also leads to under-reporting of deaths. So, recently there was a paper in the preprint site which looked at the crematoria data from China in the early part of 2020. And from that crematoria data and the number of urns that were used for storing the ashes, they surmised that the number of cases in China were at least 10 times that which were reported, and the deaths also were similarly so. Which then led them to project that probably 3 to 4 months before, that is somewhere in September or October, is when the actual pandemic may have started. Of course, this is speculation because we really don't have the exact data. But in India, even though I don't think there is an official mandate to hide data, some states have a greater capacity to record infective cases because they have a greater capacity to do tests. And let me tell you that now in the state of Pune, in the city of Pune or in the city of Delhi, RT-PCR test can be done and the results be available the same day. But in some states, the RT-PCR reports may take up to 7 days to come. So there are delays in that as well. And then, of course, in crematoria, I mean, at the best of times, only 25% of the deaths in India which occur have a properly recorded cause of death. Many times, death data is collected by doing what's called a virtual postmortem. So that's about the epidemiology and the number of cases that are occurring and the surge and how it compares with the rest of the world. Let me then tell you a little bit more about within India. So I've put together for you some representative states. So, Pune is from the state of Maharashtra, and you can see that the first peak occurred somewhere in September 17th or so. And now this peak is occurring in April. And much of April, the cases have been on the rise, and they still continue to rise. You can see Delhi. Delhi has had 4 peaks. The first 2 were relatively small. The third one was bigger, and the April is the biggest. So it seems that subsequent peaks seem to be larger in the number of cases and also in the number of deaths. And then you can see Bangalore and Kerala. They are just about now beginning to rise. And I expect that in the next 2 months, we will see these states rise as well. But this is just 4 different geographical areas. The rest of the country will happen to peak in the subsequent months. So then next about the virus mutation. So this 1.617, which Dr. Berry spoke about, is the first variant to have 2 mutations. And like she said, it's a combination of 2 variants. And there is a recent triple mutant that has been reported. So there are many questions that need to be asked, and we really don't have clear answer to this. So is it more virulent? So, just as what we are finding in this current peak of cases is that it's affecting the younger people more. During the last wave, we hardly saw any patients in the age group of 30 to 45. This time, substantial number are from this age group. And the remaining cases mostly are from the age group of 45 to 60. Hardly any of the cases are the older people. The virulence, I'm not sure. The younger people seem to have a greater inflammatory response, and they seem to do less well if they go on to require invasive mechanical ventilation. And the inflammatory markers and the inflammation seems to be more. Then with regarding to spread, it seems to be spreading more efficiently within the family. So if one member in the family comes positive, almost all members tend to come positive. And this, I think, is a little bit of a change as compared to previously. Is it more deadly? We still don't have hard data coming about the number of deaths and the mortality. Maybe in time to come, we will be able to show that better. But it certainly seems to be causing a lot more severe infections and deaths in younger people. For the vaccine, we still don't know what it means. Today, I saw a newspaper report saying that the Indian Covaxin produced by Bharat Biotech will cover this new variant as well. We don't know about the Covishield, like Dr. Berry pointed out. Maybe our vaccine person, Dr. Lalwani, will tell you more about this. Then have the modes of spread changed? So, these are 2 recent papers. One, a systematic review, which is a preprint from March 21 from Hennigan and colleagues, who were tasked by the WHO to produce this review. And they had this conclusion that said that SARS-CoV-2 RNA is detected intermittently in the air in various settings. And the lack of recoverable viral cultures of SARS-CoV-2 prevent firm conclusions over airborne transmission. And to contrast with this, we have this comment from the Lancet, which refutes this paper and says that this conclusion is probably not appropriate. And there are enough reasons to think that the COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 may be more of airborne transmission rather than droplet. Be that as it may, we do find that transmission is quite a bit. And we have realized that the spread through droplet or airborne/airborne is more than through contact. Over a period of time, in our infection control precautions, we have now tended to use less of complete personal protective equipment. And we have opted now for using surgical gowns, an N95 mask and a shield. Only for aerosol generating procedures, we prefer using the complete personal protective equipment. That in the little time, the last 1 month that we have had, does not seem to have produced a greater number of infections in our healthcare workers. Even in the last wave, we did not have so many. So that kind of goes against this thesis that it is predominantly airborne. Then about the pathogenesis and clinical course, I've already alluded that it is the younger population which is affected more. I think the rest of the things remain the same, and our understanding of the phases, the incubation, the symptomatic phase, the early pulmonary phase, and the late pulmonary phase is similar. Maybe we are seeing a little more thrombotic events. I think Priscilla will touch upon that when she does her presentation of imaging. Treatment-wise, I'm going to speak a little bit as we go along. Now, have the trials that have been done in this 1 year, have they changed our therapeutic options? So I think the one big positive has been dexamethasone from the recovery trial, and that was available before we peaked last year. And so we have used dexamethasone quite a bit. Remdesivir, the Act 1 trial showed that it can reduce the number of days of hospitalization, but no influence on any of the other things. Tocilizumab, from 6 trials that were done in the last year, the only one which showed some positive result on mortality was REMAP-CAP. The company-sponsored Covacta trial showed a negative result. Both these trials were published February 21. Baricitinib plus remdesivir seemed to perform a little better than remdesivir plus placebo. However, the other Act 4 trial, which looked at remdesivir, baricitinib, remdesivir plus dexa versus remdesivir plus dexa, was stopped early because it did not show any difference. So I guess using remdesivir dexa is good enough, and we don't need to really use baricitinib. The negative trials. Now, this has been an important thing for us because in India, many people believe that we need to use plasma, and in the general population, everybody used to demand we need plasma, we want to take convalescent plasma. And now, with the Placid and the Platina trials, these are both from India. Platina is from Maharashtra, the state where I come from. Both are negative. In fact, the Platina trial from Maharashtra showed a higher mortality. It is yet to be published, but the results which were discussed, and that has led to a change in the task force guideline, which says that we should not be using plasma. And of course, the recovery trial has stopped its plasma arm from January 2021. Then, of course, India has been a large participant in the WHO Solidarity trial, and HCQS, lopinavir, ritonavir, interferon, remdesivir have all been downgraded in the evidence of their use. And in fact, the WHO has made a conditional recommendation against its use. Then there are many smaller inconclusive trials, and this is a problem with despite smaller inconclusive trials, of the drugs being used. So which are the drugs then currently we are using? So of course, dexamethasone is being used widely. As an alternative, some people prefer the use of methylprednisolone with very or little data on methylprednisolone. Sometimes larger doses of methylprednisolone are used, especially when they suspect a cytokine storm and the other drugs are not available. Remdesivir, despite very little evidence to back it, is used quite a bit, and there is a large shortage of remdesivir, and we're struggling with that, and with the public perception that in some way it is a magic bullet or a magic drug. And this shortage of remdesivir has led to hoarding, to black marketing, and has led to the state taking control of remdesivir and then supplying it to the hospitals. Then, because of the shortage of remdesivir, and even before that, favipiravir, which is another antiviral drug, and ivermectin plus doxycycline are being used with very little data to support their use. Tocilizumab, of course, I've told you 6 trials, only one of them showing some positive results. But since there is no other option in that stage, we still continue to use tocilizumab. If tocilizumab is not available or in short supply, which was happening last year and is happening now, Then we have used itolizumab, another interleukin inhibitor, which has only very little phase 2 data to support it. Colchicine, an immunomodulator used in gout. In case we don't have tocilizumab, itolizumab, sometimes we've tended to use it. Pirfenidone in the 2nd or 3rd week, when we think it's transiting from inflammation to fibrosis, the COVID-19 pneumonia, then we use it. Baricitinib is not now available in India, but I don't think there is much role for its use. Some people have started using it. I would strongly suggest not using it. Interferon beta, one of the Indian companies has done a small phase 2 study, and the ICMR has granted emergency authorization to its use. So now this remains to be seen how this will pan out in the coming days. People being desperate for drugs to use, they will continue to use it, I guess. And then, of course, there are a host of sepsis therapies, repurposed sepsis therapies that are the favorites of intensivists. And some of these are this Mycobacterium W, also called Sepsivac, Uvinastatin, and then the cytosorb filtration, which filters cytokines that have been used in the cytokine storm with very little data and probably little benefit. Now, coming to the million-dollar question, and I think this we will tackle more as we go into the panel. So in terms of infrastructure and beds, how does India perform? So universally, I think we have a shortage of infrastructure, and this is nothing new. We have always been short of hospital beds, and therefore short of hospital beds with the facility to oxygen or to deliver acute care or intensive care has always been a big problem. And again, there is a big divide between the private and the public health infrastructure in this regard. Private probably provides for about 80% of the intensive care beds, which makes the availability of intensive care beds for people who have economic limitations to get these beds. Trained manpower, similarly, for acute care is woefully short. The specialty of intensive care, emergency medicine are very young specialties. They've been there only around for the last 7 or 8 years as a specialty recognized by the Medical Council of India. So this in time to come will improve, but currently that is a huge shortage. And then you can imagine that when the government wants to improve its number of beds, ICU beds, and deliver oxygen at dedicated COVID health centers across districts in Maharashtra or districts in the country, there will be a huge shortage of people trained in acute care. Equipment. Now, in the last 1 year, I think there has been a drive to manufacture new ventilators. There is a PM Care ventilator which is available, but we have to remember that ventilators need trained manpower to be able to operate them. And if you put a patient on a ventilator, it does not mean the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a long drawn-out battle in intensive care, which may last sometimes for a week, 2 weeks, sometimes even longer. The oxygen shortage has been coming up, and while the government has increased the oxygen production, has ramped it up by about 33%, I suspect that the need for oxygen and the demand has grown much, much, much more than that. And that leads to pictures which we see on the social media and in other places where people are struggling with oxygen cylinders. People have to pay to get their own oxygen cylinders filled. So there are many such horror stories which I won't recount. For drugs, even though India is a manufacturer for drugs, we are still short of drugs. And remdesivir, we are short. Recently, there has been a ramping up of the production of remdesivir, and I hope, even though it may not make much of a difference, remdesivir should be available all through. Vaccines, Dr. Sanjay is going to speak about, so I won't touch upon that. This is an initiative which our department and our university has prepared along with the government of Maharashtra. And this is a community e-learning website called EcoCrypt. And we've prepared this. And we want to launch this study. We've prepared this project manual, which is an entirely e-learning website complete with text, the PowerPoint presentations, and videos, allow post tests for participants. We run a few sessions, and what feedback we got is that it is difficult to get acute care training for people who have not been exposed to it on a Zoom platform or on an e-learning platform. So I'm just wondering how we will be able to ramp up acute care trained manpower without actually going to those places and training people. So these are some of the things that I've touched on, and in questions, maybe we can tackle more. I thank you very much for the patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Iyer. We'll go straight to Dr. Joshi next. Great. And Dr. Joshi has mentioned she's a radiologist. We'll talk in a little bit about the experiences she's been having in her hospital.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So good morning to everybody in the United States and good evening to those in India. Over the next 5 odd minutes, I would take you through what we've been seeing in the current surge in India. This was last year, our patient 0 in March, on the 16th of March last year. She was a 42-year-old healthcare worker, and she came in with acute hypoxemic respiratory failure. This was her first chest radiograph, subsequent chest radiograph. She had worsening on day 3, and then Shiva and his colleagues treated her, and she was finally discharged on the 8th of April. Another success story was a 95-year-old lady. She was the mother of a neighbor of mine. She was living in an old age home and contracted COVID, and she was hospitalized with us in Bharati Vidyapeeth. This was a chest radiograph. We subsequently did a CT for her because she had a lot of oxygen requirement. She went home and is till this day healthy. This was her first hospitalization, by the way. Coming to this time round, almost a year later, what we are seeing is that the socioeconomic strata affected is different. It's a middle and a higher middle class, which is affected. Like Shiva said, we have entire families which are affected. The lung involvement we are seeing on CT and on plain radiographs is more severe and more commonly seen than we saw in the last surge. The spectrum of lung findings is also different. We are seeing many more vascular complications. We end up doing at least 5 or 6 CT angiographies per day, predominantly for cerebral angiographies and pulmonary angiographies. We are seeing more pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum. The COVID sequelae we are seeing are also more. We are seeing more residual lung changes. We are imaging more this time round. And maybe one of the reasons for this sudden surge could be the vaccination drive, which had started, and the people who were not maintaining social distancing during the vaccination drive. The patients who come in tend to attribute their COVID infection to the vaccination and say, we took the first vaccination and look what's happened to us. And this is when we are taking a history from them while doing the CT scan. So last year, what we were seeing was predominantly this ground glass kind of opacity, which was seen over both lungs, and the severity depended on the distribution on this. Now we are seeing denser opacities, more confluent and widely spread opacities, and we are getting scores of 24 on 25. And in fact, my residents recounted to me an incident where a whole family, the father, mother, and the son had come for a CT scan. The father had his CT scan done, and the mother and the son couldn't get it done because we got a stroke patient. We are using the same CT scanner for all patients. So they had to give a gap and scan the stroke patient. And when they were looking for the son and they called him up, he said, my father, who had a score of 24 by 25, is no more. And we are not coming back for a CT scan. Some of the lung lesions are looking different. We are getting a lot of these nodular lesions which are there, which are similar to something you would see in fungal infections. But this patient has been ill only for about 4 days. So it's unlikely he's been on steroids. And that's why it's unlikely that this is fungal infection. So are these septic emboli, or is it because of endarterite involvement, the pulmonary emboli which are there, the thrombi going peripherally, which is causing this? We are also seeing a couple of patients who had this halo sign, which is something again, which we see commonly in aspergillus and fungal infection. This was a 32-year-old male patient, again, just 4 days of fever, RT-PCR positive, and we were seeing this large cavity. Now, we are not sure whether this is caused by COVID or whether the patient had an underlying tuberculosis. Cystic areas and bullae which are developing in the lung. This patient was post-COVID and she was admitted with difficulty in breathing. And this is what she had, these cystic areas. We are also seeing a higher incidence of pneumomediastinum and pneumothorax, and this is a patient who had pneumomediastinum along with the lung findings. We are seeing many, many more vascular complications. This patient, again, was a young patient, 37 years old, and he had left lower limb ischemia. When we did a CT angiography for him, they wanted to cover the upper as well as the lower limb vessels, which we couldn't do. We said we'll do one limb we'll do the lower limbs or the upper limbs. So we covered right from the aortic arch to the lower limbs till the toes. And what we saw was extensive thrombosis of the common iliac and femoral artery on the left. The patient also had a thrombus in the aorta. The left subclavian artery was also thrombosed. There were bilateral renal infarcts and splenic infarcts as well. This was a patient who presented as stroke, and there was occlusion of the left internal carotid artery from just distal to the bifurcation up to the supraclinoid segment. Luckily for him, the anterior communicating artery was supplying the opposite side. There was contralateral supply from the contralateral ICA, and there was a very small ischemic area which we were seeing, and that's how he didn't end up with a large infarct. Pulmonary embolism, we are seeing a lot of it, and so is everybody else around the world. We are seeing a lot of post-COVID residual changes which are occurring. This was a husband of a hospital employee. He was 47 years old. He had past history of tuberculosis. This was his first CT where we were seeing the evidence of old tuberculosis. The rest of his lungs seemed essentially clear and normal. This was about 20 days later when he worsened, and you could see the classical changes of COVID disease or viral pneumonia bilaterally in his lungs. One also saw the pneumomediastinum, which was there over here as well as here. Subsequently, he continued to have an increased demand for oxygen, and on 27th of April, that was yesterday, we ran a CT pulmonary angio for him. The pulmonary angio was normal, but his CT, the HRCT images showed us these cystic areas in the lung, which were not there earlier. He also had extensive interlobular septal thickening, suggestive of interstitial lung disease. So we really need to follow up these patients and see whether these changes persist or how much, or worsen or get better. So we are imaging more than we did last time. We are doing more CT scans than plain radiographs. We are scanning families because everybody in the family seems to be affected. And someone, or they maybe the WhatsApp university has told them that you can get a lot of information from a CT scan. So everybody wants a CT scan done. Also, CT reports are faster. Within an hour, we are giving the reports as compared to an RT-PCR. So practically, it's helping people to decide on isolation. Prognostication is easier. Efficient management is easier. We are doing much, much more vascular imaging around this time. And we're evaluating sequelae and complications. A little about the patients we are scanning and doing CTs this time. We are also taking a history regarding vaccine. And we have found that 90 to 95% of the patients who have come for CT scans have not taken the vaccine, vis-a-vis about 5% or less than 5% who've taken the first dose, and maybe just about 1% who've taken 2 doses. So we are much better off. We find that those who have taken the vaccine are definitely getting protection from the vaccine. This is what I think we need, a combination of this and this, the vaccine and the lockdown. Thank you for your kind attention. I'd like to thank Sonu and Errol for inviting me and Dr. Iyer and Dr. Lalwani to present our experience from India.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, again for that. And we'll move on to Dr. Lalwani. Dr. Lalwani, you were muted just in case. There, yeah, you're unmuted.
Good morning to all of you in the US and good evening to all in India. I'm going to speak on COVID vaccine trials which have been taken in our country and what's the rollout of the vaccine in our country. So I will first touch on the trials which are ongoing and what is the rollout program which is in our country. Now, the current vaccines in India, which have been licensed by the regulatory, the 3rd Jan this year, the regulatory authorities approved Covishield, which is the vector vaccine where we have the chimpanzee adenovirus and the spike protein by AstraZeneca and manufactured at Pune by Serum Institute. And this contributes 95% of our vaccination program at present. And the second one, which is the Indian indigenous COVID vaccine called Covaxin, which is manufactured by Bharat Biotech, and it's the wholesale killed vaccine, and it was licensed for restricted use in emergency. So these were the 2 vaccines which started in India in the vaccination schedule. This year, on 12th April, this month, 12th April, the regulatory approved the Sputnik vaccine, which we all know has been developed in Russia. It is initially going to be bought from there and then manufactured by few laboratories in India. Vaccine is yet to arrive in our country, and it's again a vector-borne where we have the human chimpanzee, human adenovirus, and the spike protein embedded on it. The other vaccines which are in pipeline, they are following. The one with the, so 3 have been licensed now. The 4th one would get licensed. We are in the phase 3 trial at our unit, is the DNA vaccine by Zycovet-D by Cadila Zydus in India. And I think it should see the licensure in the month of June. The another one is biological E, I think where there's a tie-up with Johnson & Johnson for manufacturing later on at a unit. Then the Pune-based company called Genova, which is now looking at the first mRNA vaccine of our country. Bharat Biotech is looking at the nasal vaccine, which will give a local immunity and prevent the mucosal disease. And of course, Serum Institute of India has been applying regulatory for the phase 3 trial for the Novavax. And these are the vaccines which would get licensure in India subsequently in the 3rd or the 4th half of this particular year. Now, how do the introduction of the vaccine took place in India? After the licensure came, the whole vaccination program is controlled by the central government. And the first decision was taken that all healthcare workers, which was around 10 million, and all the frontline workers, which were around 20 millions, would be vaccinated. And these were the people who were vaccinated in the initial part. Initially, we started giving Covishield 2 shots at an interval of 4 weeks. And then there was an amendment saying that you could keep a gap of 6 weeks between the 2 doses, and the other Indian vaccine, 2 doses with a gap of 4 weeks. Then the next phase was they looked at the high-risk population, where those who were above the age of 60 years and those who were between 45 to 60 years with associated comorbidities. That was the first group, and these were approximately around 260 to 270 millions. So this government of ours was looking at vaccinating around 300 million population. The next amendment came that they diluted it to anybody above the age of 45 years. Now, this was solely based on the availability of the vaccine, the epidemiological basis for future planning of the vaccine. The goal of the vaccine was to protect public health, minimize societal and economic impact by reducing the COVID-19 mortality. So if you look at the rollout program of the vaccine in India, the phase 1, 16 January this year, it was launched. It was mainly for the healthcare workers and the frontline healthcare workers, which were looking at roughly around 30 millions. The phase 2 on 1st March, above 60 years and between 45 to 60 years with comorbidity. And from 1st of April this month, it was anybody above the age of 45 years. Now, this together would contribute around 300 million. That's a huge number, and 2 doses. The government then, in the 3rd week of April, rolled out a phase 3, saying that from 1st May, coming month, they will roll out above 18 years. The $1 million question is from where this vaccine is going to come, because if you are going to roll out above 18 years, you are going to add another 400 million doses to roll out, and how it's going to happen is a big question mark. India launched its first vaccination drive on 16th of January. A sanitation worker from a country became the first recipient of the world's largest inoculation drive of the COVID vaccine. So if you look at the data, which is as today morning, if you look at the total beneficiary of 1.4 billion population of our country, the first dose has been received by approximately 125 million, and yesterday 1.5 million took. The second dose beneficiary, both the doses together, were around 25 million, and 1 million took in last 24 hours. So look at the number of recipient of vaccine in our country till today morning. We have 150 million, and I think 2.5 million took in last 24 hours. Now this, try to understand, of 1.4 billion population, it's only 25 million population getting 2 doses, saying that not more than 2% of our total population still in this surge are really vaccinated. We have a huge load of the people to be vaccinated in days to come. Phase 3 strategies, government came out with another plan saying that the government was buying the dose from the vaccine manufacturer at a cost of $2 only, and it was given free of cost to the entire population. Government announced it in the last week of April. The vaccine manufacturer in the country, primarily Serum Institute and Bharat Biotech, when of course the one Russian vaccine, the government central government will take 50% of the doses, and remaining 50% will go to state government. There was a price tag difference to the central government and to the state government, and whatever remains will come out to a private market or to a corporate world at different. So we had a complex pricing system of vaccine supply to central government, to state government, and to a private practice. The division of vaccine supply, 50% to Government of India and 50% to other Government of India channel, would be applicable uniformly to all the vaccine manufactured in our country. However, Government of India now will allow imported fully ready to use vaccines to be entirely used in other than Government of India channel. That means those vaccines which were licensed in the US or the European market or the Japanese market do not require any bridging studies, and they can be easily accessible to the private market. And this decision was taken just last week. Phase 3 strategy, Government of India criteria for vaccine allocation to the states or the union territories will depend upon the extent of infection, that is the number of active COVID cases in that province, performance of that particular province, and the wastage. Because the wastage of the vaccine, whatever national figures are coming, it is differing from province to province. Vaccine manufacturers were incentivized very late in this pandemic, and I think it came just a week back where both the manufacturers were given a financial support to scale up their productions as well as to attract new international and national players. But I think even if their incentivization has taken place, by the time they ramp up their capacities and they get it into the market to be used by the public at large, I think there is an incubation period of 2 to 3 months to happen. So whatever ramping they have done, I think that would become a reality somewhere in first week of July, not earlier than that. The phase 3 part, second dose of all existing priority group vaccines like healthcare workers and the frontline workers and the population above 45 years, wherever it has become due, would be given on priority, free of cost from a government setup. Now, the $1 million question was 300 million to be vaccinated. Only we have vaccinated a small part of it, and the government took a bold decision of announcing that all those above the age of 18 years would get vaccination from 1st May 2021. But from where these vaccines are going to come is $1 million question. This and another issue was when the vaccine after first surge came, there was a lot of public hesitancy of taking a vaccine, and the government was asking people to take vaccine. What has happened is after the second surge, a lot of them succumbing to it, suddenly the awareness of vaccine and does vaccine protects from getting the severe form of disease has really made the public at large to crowd in number of lines to get the vaccine at various booths across the country. In conclusion, the incentivizing of Indian manufacturers for increased production so that a large population of our country would get vaccination, and that above age of 18 years, even if the ramping capacity takes place in the month of June and we have 2 or 3 manufacturers adding to it, and few of the vaccines coming from the international market, are we going to be in a position to vaccinate a large number of our population by an year end is a big question mark, one. Second, what happens to a population which is less than 18 years? They are not going to see a vaccination in year 2021, I think 2022, because the trials are still not on in the pediatric age group. I think the Zydus is above the age of 12 years. They have allowed an import of ready-to-use vaccines from foreign countries, but are they in a position to supply to our country? I think the cost of buying a vaccine from any of the Indian manufacturer by a central government for a huge population of ours at $2 a dose vis-a-vis the vaccine bought by the international market from international manufacturers goes around $40 a dose. And for a huge population, the financial implications will have to be looked into it and whether they are able to supply it. Allowing use of 50% of quota of vaccine manufactured in India by state government and the private setup at prefix rate would create a lot of confusion, as there would be a 3-tier system, different from central, different for state, and different for private practice. Challenges. The biggest challenge now, and I think that's $1 million question, the availability of vaccines to huge Indian population and speed of vaccination. And just before this discussion started, I think we had a discussion that the Serum Institute of India, the owner, has got a security from the government because he is actually been pounced on by a lot of people in the state and the central government and the corporate to supply a vaccine to them. I think that's all from my end, and I think we are open for question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panelists to come on. And since we're running so late, I'd love to ask the panelists to come up with one unique pressing issue that you think should be addressed so that we can get to our Q&A. Oh, sorry, my video. There I am. Sunu, you want to start?
Thanks, Michele. I would say addressing inequity, because none of us is safe until all of us are safe. I grew up in India. It's a country like ours in the United States with a great deal of inequity, and pandemics like this cannot protect anyone, no matter how many guards and how many gates you have.
Thank you. Aruna?
I would say making sure the healthcare workers have enough personal protective equipment, N95s, really making sure that we don't lose the workers and that they feel protected and supported, because it sounds like during this surge, you know, that they must be really, really stressed, and I just want to not forget the healthcare workers and making sure they're protected and there's enough N95s and other equipment for them.
Thank you. And Nidhi, are you there?
Yes, thanks, Michele. I think I would say that there is no concept of primary care physicians, and healthcare access is very difficult. The goal will be to keep as many patients at home as we could and monitor them. If there is some remote monitoring that we could provide, I know we think in terms of providing money and medications, but really what patients sometimes need is that if we can monitor for worsening clinical status and provide some basic advice, so the healthcare workers can really focus on the sickest of the patients. Like at this point, I have a panel of people that I'm following and just remotely just helping them out at home. I think that is a very valuable tool for many.
Thank you. So now I'd like to, unless Manu, are you on? I don't think you're on, but I'd like to get to some questions. Alan Barkin asked, and this I guess goes to our Indian colleagues, why haven't Pfizer and Moderna vaccines been approved? Anyone want to take that?
I think the question is why the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine have been approved.
Yes, and I'm going to add one other thing, and our monoclonal antibodies, another person asked that, being used.
See, first and foremost, both the vaccines require a temperature to store of -20 to -80 degrees centigrade. As far as our country goes and the cold chain, we do not have that efficient cold chain across the country to store the vaccine as -20 to -80. That's number one. Number two, I think we had a lot of hurdles by our regulatories saying that any vaccine which is used in any other country, it should be having some amount of bridging studies because the ethnicity makes a difference as far as the response to vaccine was concerned. And I think we who are in the vaccine expert groups here, we have been asking and lobbying with the government, saying that those vaccines which have approved by few of the regulatories internationally should not have any bridging study in this pandemic, and they should be given clearances. So those who could come into a private market and make it accessible to people who could afford it. But I think that decision the government has taken last week back, and they have allowed these companies who are into the international market to come and enter the private market in India. But as on today, it doesn't look that these vaccines the government is going to buy. And another $1 million question is whether these manufacturers will be in a position to supply a vaccine in such a large quantity for a large population of ours to vaccinate. I think that also is a big question which needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Another, Dr. Swathig asked a question is, why is not the available infrastructure for polio vaccines, such as community healthcare workers, being used to go door to door for vaccination?
Yeah, I think so. There were slight hesitancy when they rolled out the program. I think the $1 million question was, before rolling out program, they should have had analysis done how many doses are there in the kitty and how they are going to relay and see how they are going to cover up. Now, what has happened in our country is the Serum Institute of India had manufactured the vaccine before it was licensed to be used in the country. And when the licensure came, I think the number of doses available for them was short. And the story is today that most of the centers in the country are running dry because of non-availability of vaccine. I fully understand that the vaccination program in the National Immunization Program, and especially for the polio eradication program in a form of the pulse polio program, which have been running, is so good. I'm sure the government is capable of handling a massive program of vaccination. The $1 million question is, vaccines are not going to be available. And I think that needs to be looked into.
Thank you. Two questions I'm gonna, because we're running out of time. Were the crematoriums workers, were they in the first wave of vaccination, and should they be?
The crematorium workers were considered as a frontline workers, and they were vaccinated as a frontline workers.
Thank you. And here's a question to Dr. Joshi, our radiologist. Millions are asymptomatic or mild COVID survivors. Are pulmonary changes seen in asymptomatic survivors? And how long do these abnormalities last?
We have seen asymptomatic patients also having some degree of pulmonary involvement. They're very mild. And we really haven't followed them up on CT to see how long their findings last on CT. We are doing a post-COVID study now. We are studying patients post-COVID, but those would all be symptomatic patients. I don't think the asymptomatic ones would come back. In case they do, we'll see and we'll publish the data.
Okay. And then I have a very heart-rendering one from, let's see if I can find it, from Michele Patel, who talked about his family getting misinformation. I have several about misinformation and freedom of expression about COVID-19 vaccination. Can you comment, any of the panelists comment on that?
Yeah, so I think so. Initially, when the vaccination drive was started in India, as usual, there was a vaccine hesitancy, and also the literacy part in the country is a big question mark, and a lot of people, a lot of social media, WhatsApp and other things saying that this vaccine can cause this complication. There are thrombotic episodes. The vaccines are not very safe. But I think so, as the disease burden has spread, the vaccine hesitancy has really come down. A lot of people are queuing up at the vaccination centers to take the vaccine. But I personally think so that after the 2 doses of taking of vaccine, the parenchymal lesions have come down, mucosal infection does take place. And I think both the vaccines used in India, whether it's the AstraZeneca or the Covaxin, I think both of them, 2 doses, I'm sure it will have a huge impact on the morbidity and the mortality of COVID-19 in India.
And then I'll end, because we're sort of over, but maybe I'll go a few minutes over. Carl Lorenz, one of our palliative care doctors here, says, how do you balance treatment and relief? A single dose of remdesivir in India costs as much as the opioids that would relieve dyspnea in 5,000 to 10,000 people. What about those who can't access hospitals?
Shiva, you want to take it?
You know, what I would like to say to that is that the remdesivir course will now cost around 10,000 rupees for the entire year. And the use of morphine, I guess, being a palliative care physician, he is alluding to the availability and use of morphine for palliative reasons. And that drug availability is now becoming more widespread in India. But we are not using remdesivir in patients who come into intensive care or those who are posted for palliative care. Usually, remdesivir is reserved for use in early cases, and certainly patients who go beyond 9 days, remdesivir is not being used.
Thank you. A couple of questions about reinfection. Are you starting to see reinfection in those who have been infected? And is the vaccine adequate? Are you starting to see infections with vaccinated, not 1, but 2 doses?
So we have seen infections coming up in people who have had both doses of vaccines, but they are very few. And reinfections too are extremely rare. And even if the reinfection occurs, those reinfections have not really been severe.
And yes, go ahead.
Another observation of ours was in the first surge of vaccine, we had a lot of healthcare workers and frontline workers getting affected and had morbidity and mortality. Now, these were the same people which were vaccinated by government, and most of the frontline workers and the healthcare workers have taken 2 doses of vaccine. And in the second surge, we have very, very few healthcare workers and the frontline workers getting affected. And those who are getting affected, I think the disease is mainly mucosal. So I firmly believe that the vaccine works in decreasing the parenchymal infection, and it does decrease the morbidity and mortality. And I think the Priscilla's last cartoon, lockdown and the effective vaccination, 2 strategies would really help us to get out of this COVID pandemic.
Can I just add to that?
Go ahead.
Amongst all the CT, like I mentioned earlier, the CT scans, when we are doing them, we are taking a history of prior vaccination, and 90 to 95% of the patients who had a CT done and had lung involvement had not taken the vaccine. Just about 5% had taken 1 dose, and it was probably 1% or less than 1% who had taken 2 doses, and they had barely any lung involvement. So that proves that the vaccines are working, whichever one it is. We couldn't get a proper history regarding which vaccine they've taken because people are not very clear about it at times. But definite history of vaccination we could get from the patients.
I'm going to end, because it's 5 after, with several questions that are, how do I tell my family at home which drugs to take, how to care for themselves at home? And I think if anybody has time, in the chat, Dr. Ankur Barja has given several references as to how to care for folks at home and what you should be saying. There's a palliative care hotline he's given as well. And you should know that several of us, not several, many of us from around the country, the US, are meeting almost on a daily basis. And Manu Prakash, who I hope would be here, and Manu Pai from Toronto have developed a laminated or a card algorithm as to what you can tell your relatives at home. So I'm going to thank our panelists for a fabulous last minute, but very up-to-date description of this crisis is happening in India and let you know that all of our hearts go out to you. We in the Valley have a lot of South Asians here, and we are very worried about what's happening there. And if there's one last question, if there's one thing that we can do as a community or one charity or donation, where would you give it to? Any of my panelists?
I would say give it to UNICEF or an organization that's helping with the COVAX effort, because again, it has to be for everyone.
Thank you, Sunu, and thank you, Errol, because you really did an amazing amount of work to bring this panel and guests together. And Sunu, thank you as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Barron, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
so much.
Thanks a lot.
Dr. Barry.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you.